Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Dali Museum tonight for another episode of Our Town, a program that we do at the end of each month, hosted by Dr. Carol Mickett. We want to thank Doyle Wealth Management and Allstate Roadside Assistance for providing generous benefits to help this program to happen. And also, we encourage you, if you're not a member, to consider, because this is certainly driven by our membership opportunities. And we do have the Picasso show coming up very soon in November, which you will certainly be able to take advantage of as a member. And with that, we are very pleased to have David Warner with us tonight, and I will now step aside and turn it over to Dr. Carol Mickett. Thank you.
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
Oh,
we're
good.
unmuted. Welcome to Our Town at the wonderful Dali Museum. I'm Carol Mickett, and many of you who have followed this series knows that newspapers are very important to me. I believe, as Plato and Aristotle did, that to be a good citizen, you have to learn to be a good citizen. It isn't a natural thing that you're born with. And one of the best ways to become a good citizen is to read the newspaper.
There was an audible snort.
Yeah,
We will find the snorter
from
and seek her
an
out.
obsessive newspaper reader. So the reason that newspapers are so important, and there's many different kinds. There's, for example, in this country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, that give you big national news. And then there's local papers like the Tampa Bay Times and Creative Loafing.
Thank you.
How many people in here work for Creative Loafing? Let's see the hands. There's a
Three.
few.
I will explain that the rest of my staff is at an event called Margarita Wars.
I think there's actually four. I think there's four people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, sure, if you want to, yeah, let's go.
So one of the things about newspapers I find interesting is how they choose what to print. So if I had a newspaper, my own newspaper, my headline would read, "Happy Birthday, Robert Stackhouse." But, you know, it wasn't on any other headline today. But that's what's interesting. Why do they print what they print? And that's one thing I would like to find out today. How do you become, what's the vision of a particular paper and how they differ? And to do that, we have a special person who's an editor-in-chief. And eventually, I hope through the night, we will find out what that means. Editor-in-chief.
Oh,
It's,
dear.
you know, it's not editor-and-chief, it's editor-in-chief. So he will explain this
I
to
will
us.
explain that.
And the he is, of course, David Warner. So please, let's welcome him to our town. So the first question, as everybody knows, is how did you get to St. Pete?
It was kind of a circuitous route. My husband, then partner, Larry Biddle, who is in the audience today.
And where is Larry?
He is
There he is.
raising his hand there. He was at that time in politics, and we had been. I was.
And
from,
he's not still in
Yeah,
politics?
well, who isn't in politics now? But I was for a long time the editor of the Philadelphia City paper, which is the alternative weekly. Hey, great. Wow, where did you come? Take a bus down? Thank you very much. Had been there for quite a while, and Larry got this opportunity to work on the Dean campaign in Burlington, Vermont. And so I said, hey, I've been doing this for a while, let's take a break. And we went up to Burlington, which is a very cool place, actually.
where
In many
Ben-
ways that St. Pete is cool.
Ben and Jerry's.
And Ben and Jerry's, yes, yes. One of the publishers of the paper where I worked there, because I did work for as a theater writer and a columnist in Burlington for a while, was either Ben or Jerry's girlfriend. I couldn't remember which one, ever. But anyway,
Did they look alike?
Ben, Jerry,
Yeah.
who can tell? But but she was beautiful, so lucky whichever one had her as a girlfriend. And Dean did what Dean did, and so Larry was looking for other opportunities, and and he found one in helping work on Betty Castor's Senate campaign, which took him to Florida, and I had never had any inclination to be taken to Florida, to go to Florida willingly, to touch Florida's earth at all.
And here you are.
And here I am, and this is interesting because, I went down to check it out. I mean, they had actually offered me a full-time job at the paper in Burlington, so I was considering it. And then Larry, devious fellow that he is, rented me a convertible like Sebring or something, which I think you had the same experience.
I had the same
right?
experience
This-
in Georgia.
The Sebring
Yes.
seduction.
Yes,
and so
exactly.
I drove over the Skyway with a top down in that Sebring convertible, and I said, okay, I could
This
do
is
this.
a lesson.
Yes, I could do this. And the thing about, and then as it happened at almost exactly the same time, the Weekly Planet, which was Creative Loafing in one incarnation before it was originally Creative Loafing, and then it went back to being Creative Loafing. Some of you probably remember Weekly Planet was looking for a new editor, and so I applied, and here I am. It's been a real voyage of discovery for me. I think all of those preconceptions that I had about Florida have really been subverted by St. Petersburg in particular, where we moved after 1 year in Tampa and bought a house. And I continue to be excited by what we discover. And it's sort of an answer to your question about what you decide to put in the paper. A lot of what informs me, and I think that this is true of anybody in journalism, is what you discover. You're about discovering things. And with St. Petersburg being on the rise now and new things happening all the time, it's a great time to be a paper like ours, to be able to be in touch with that.
So your job is to be editor-in-chief. So
Yes.
can we get that clear?
Do you
What does
want me to
that mean?
It's the
Yeah.
chief thing. I'm embarrassed by that title, in fact. We were recently purchased, or a couple of years ago. You probably, if any of you are regular readers of the Weekly Planet and Creative Loafing, there was this blip, a bankruptcy blip. And the previous owners, the founders, who were part of the family that founded the Creative Loafing chain, lost the paper, and we were purchased by a hedge fund. And then the hedge fund sold us to Southcom, which is a company based in Nashville, which believes in alternative news weeklies, believes in print, has lots of papers, Creative Loafing papers among them around the country, mostly in the Southeast, but also in Cincinnati and a few other places. And their HR people refer to their editors as editor-in-chief. So I got that from HR one day, that's what I am. So I figured, okay, what the hell? I'll call myself editor-in-chief.
But what does it mean?
What does it mean? Oh, okay, well,
How
I mean,
can you be
I'm
in-a-chief?
I'm not actually inside the chief.
But it's the editor in.
I'm in control. Maybe that's what it means. That wouldn't sound good. Editor in control.
then you're chief, like
the buck
Superman.
stops with me, except
Right.
for the financial decisions, which are the
Bear-
publishers.
Mr. White in Superman, remember they
Not
always
Walter
called him
White. Okay, Mr. White.
Mr. White. They always called him chief.
Yes, chief.
Chief.
I should insist on that.
Yes.
Yes, but I don't.
Yeah.
I'm probably the least chiefy chief you'll ever find. Right? In fact, we were on TV this morning because this is our intern issue this week. This is, I guess, when Vanna holds up the thing.
I would have to walk.
Right.
Right.
We, once a year, or this is the second year we've done this, we essentially let our summer college interns essentially determine the content of that paper and create it. And it's great.
Good idea.
It's really an exciting project. And we were on a television show this morning talking about the issue, and the interviewer asked the intern who was with me, Amy Dare, what surprised her. And she said, well, it was a lot less gung-ho than I thought. It was a lot more relaxed. It was fun. So I guess that's good.
Now, even though it's the intern paper, did you still act as editor-in-chief? So
Yeah.
there wasn't an intern
I
editor-in-chief?
mean, that's a good idea of what happens when I edit an issue, is that you've got all this raw material, some of it rawer than others, and you, with the help of the others on the edit staff, shape it into first readable prose, but
one hopes your
one hopes
people-
one hope. I mean, that's maybe that seems like a low bar, but it's very important first. And I don't know, a lot of publications don't feel that's a bar to rise above, but I do. The thing that happens next, though, is how these all to go together. It was definitely came from the interns what the theme of the issue would be, which would more often than not come from me and the staff. Okay, if we want to do an issue that has a theme, what are we going to write about? And for them, in all the discussions about the issue, they talked about, oh, that's the music issue. Yes, the music
See?
issue.
A
That was the
theme.
theme. Sorry, I didn't mean you were doing that. Not surprisingly, perhaps, a lot of them were worried about what would happen when they graduate from college. And more
Are they
larger
journalism
than that,
majors?
most of them, yeah, all of them were. All of them communications, English, or journalism majors, and wondering not only that, but what's it mean to grow up? What does it mean to grow up? Have I grown up? How do I know when I grow up? And so
Do you
all of
know
this,
that?
I don't know
I don't know that
no,
either.
and it's a really good question.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things about it in the story, one of the things they came up with was to go to their parents or significant elders, I called them, and talk to them about how they knew when they grew up. And there's some actually lovely short answers to that in full-page things. So there was that. I mean, but then we also said, do you have some ideas for other departments? What about arts? What about music? What about food, style? And they were all involved in creating stories for those sections as well.
Peter, did you write an article in here for this one? But not in the intern one?
Not in the intern.
Is there a
Your internship's
intern
over.
poet page? No intern poet?
Well, Peter Meinke, who
Yes,
is our
and Jeannie
Poet's
Meinke,
Notebook,
yes.
and Jeannie Meinke, who illustrates it, a regular columnist of ours.
And they were our town guests?
Yes. Are on every other week when we keep to our schedule, yes. So
What?
this wasn't their week.
Yeah. So we have actually we have three, probably more, we have more papers than that, but I'm going to mention three. We have your paper, Creative Loafing. Well, wait a second, where does this title come from? Creative Loafing.
Well, that goes back to the founding of the paper in Atlanta in the 70s. Ben Eason's family, I think his parents were finding a need for a guide to the kinds of things they like to do, which essentially was creatively loaf. And even though they had businesses of their own, and I don't know the actual genesis of when they came up with that particular idea, but that's where it came from. It goes way back to the founding of the paper.
Because at least now, the thought of loafing is not viewed as a positive thing. You know, you were loafing around.
It's not even so much that. We did a marketing study once where we found that there was a certain segment of the population, say younger than us, who didn't know what loafing
Younger than
is. Yeah, believe it or not. Who didn't know didn't know loaf or loafing
What they thought
had
was
anything to
making
do.
bread or
yes,
something?
yeah. Thought it just didn't resonate with them, let's just say. And I don't know if that was in the decision because I wasn't working for the paper when Ben Eason decided to change it to the Weekly Planet. But we've
Does
heard that
anybody
since.
in here well, how many people know what the word loafing means?
Oh, good.
Is anyone, did anyone not raise their hand?
So good.
Yeah.
Because I want to be a paper for people who understand most words. And I'm not actually being totally facetious there.
Right, I got that.
I'm not, because I think that a column like Peter's, for instance, which is
Oh,
a
yeah.
sophisticated column,
Very sophisticated.
based on language,
yeah.
actually framed by poetry, but not necessarily about poetry.
And Whitman has a famous phrase, I loaf and invite my soul.
Nice. We should put that under the name of
Yes.
the paper every week.
That's very good.
But I want there to be a place for readers who are looking for that kind of experience. I mean, that's not all we do. It's not the only experience we offer, but I think it's valuable to provide that.
Okay. So now I'll ask my question, other
Okay.
question. So I'm going to look at 3 papers in the area. The Tampa Bay Times, the Tampa Tribune, and Creative Loafing. Now, so we have 3 papers in the Tampa Bay, and I know there's more, but let's just look at those. So what makes them different that one would want those papers, all of them?
It kind of relates to what I was just talking about, I think. All of us in this business now are, the distinction used to be daily versus weekly. That still exists to some extent, but when the Times has a daily free paper, when we're
The
all
TBT.
the TBT, when we all are like alert to news 24/7 through our websites, cltampabay.com, cltampa.com, then those distinctions began to blur. I mean, I think also that's true in terms of what an alternative news weekly is. That's the tradition we came from the Boston Phoenix, from the Village Voice. Boston Phoenix, RIP. It's an example of what's happened to some of these papers, but the Village Voice is still carrying on. And in many cases, those publications were created in opposition to what was perceived as a mainstream press that wasn't paying attention to alternative communities, it wasn't paying attention to underground art, it wasn't paying attention to alternate political points of view, or else it was a daily paper that was completely controlled by a particular political position.
So what
which
does this
had been the
word
case, I think, for many years for the Tribune.
alternative mean?
That's the alternative. That's where that was born. It was
Okay.
an alternative, but I think it was also out of the idea of there being an alternative culture, which is where cities were leading the
So in
way.
the 60s
It was
that was
cities,
coming up.
and it was a very urban thing. I mean, I think that's still true. All these kinds of papers arose in city environments.
Like the Village Voice.
Like the Village Voice, but not just a big eastern city, but places like Kansas City, places like Denver,
The Pitch.
places San Francisco, and all of the things, papers, Philadelphia, where I was, had 2 alternative news weeklies and still does. And
So alternative means alternative to the
At least in the
daily
genesis of
major.
it,
So
yeah.
in Philadelphia, it'd be alternative to the
the
Inquirer.
Inquirer and the Daily News.
Right. Okay.
And
See,
but-
I didn't understand that, so that
Well, that's
really
where I was
helps.
born. Whether that's still true or not is the question, because I think there's the lines blur now. I think that where the alternative papers were very much emphasizing voice, they were not afraid of letting an author's personality come through in his writing or her writing. You see that much more now in even daily news reporting. I mean, it's that fear, that sense that you have to present everything in a very stuffy, this is the news kind of presentation is pretty much gone. I mean, the principles in all of these papers, hopefully, are shared in that your first priority is accuracy, and that you will that you're looking for the facts, and that if it is opinion, it's presented as opinion. Those lines blurred in some ways
they
in
do.
alternative newspapers, and I hope they don't with mine. Maybe that we trip up. I mean, and the other part of this that's really interesting is that all of us are in this playing field of online, which is pretty much the alternative news weekly of today. It's the alternative news second, the alternative news daily to the minute. And what happens with that is that it's always a challenge to keep the quality of that work as high and keep the standards to what you would do in print to the same level. And so the
And that's a
landscape's
challenge.
changed.
And-
Well, it's a challenge, but it's one you want to oversee. I mean, it helps if you have a big staff. We don't have a big staff, but it still doesn't.
How big is your staff?
Well, let's see.
You have one of your staff,
One of my staff, Scott, how many do we have? 8?
Editorial?
8 full-time editorial?
I think 7.
7.
And then other
Then a
people-
lot of contributors, freelance
because
contributors.
Megan Buller's
Yes.
here, and
Is Megan Bowler here?
yeah, she's
oh,
here.
hi, I didn't see you.
she writes the
Another good example
Visual
of someone
arts
who
column.
writes up to the reader rather
Yeah.
down.
She's a good writer.
And I think, so we have a really good stable of freelance contributors, but a small core of full-time people. And all of them are as much involved with online as they are with print.
So, as your job as editor-in-chief,
I'm really seriously considering deleting that now.
I take it it's your job to create the voice of the paper. And how do you do that?
That's a good question. One thing I do is I feel like I want to hear the voice of the writer. I don't want to make the writer sound like me. And that's a temptation as an editor. You can probably, anybody who's read enough of what I've written probably can spot it in somebody else's and say, oh, David must have put that in there. But I try to avoid that. And
So
I think,
you rewrite, you
do I
edit?
I edit, I read everything. I'm not the first editor on everything. So but if something is, with the exception of a few of the regular features like Savage Love and News of the Weird, which come to us pretty well intact, and I know intact. What am I going to say? I touch everything that goes in. I don't have anything to do with the ads, but I do look at everything that's going past my desk.
So
yeah.
back to that. So what do you want to accomplish? I guess in some way you said this, but that's different from the Trib and the Times.
Well, I think if we're talking about the print product specifically,
let's
talk
talk
about
about
the print product specifically. I think that's a very different experience than the Times or the Trib. It's, I guess, for want of a better word, it's more of a magazine experience. It's, I like the looks of that. I'll page through. Maybe I'll come back to that later in the week. This is very compelling. I'm going to read this right now. Or I like the experience of just flipping through it because it's visually very satisfying. It has a unifying kind of visual identity, and that I like that as an object. I want people to feel like this week coming up in this area, in the Tampa Bay area, and to some extent in Florida, is encapsulated to some degree in this paper. I mean, and it may be just an aspect of it. I mean, for instance, the music issue, I think, encapsulates what's out there in terms, if you're looking for live independent music. If you want to know what it is, you will have found it in that issue that week. And you might keep it, and that's a good thing. That may be not something that would happen with a daily paper.
Right. You keep it as a guide.
Yeah, you might keep it longer than you would.
I
You
do
might keep
sometimes.
weekend for a while, but you keep it maybe just for the weekend.
Right.
But you want it to have a certain degree of shelf life. And that informs some of the special publications we're doing now, which even extend that shelf life even more, like the Ask the Locals that we talked about, because it is more of literally a magazine. And Best of the Bay is something that many people keep all year round. Oh, and there's the Best of the Bay winner. That had nothing to do with her selection of me for this interview.
Maybe I'll take you hunting.
Mr. Cheney.
So I take it that you like what you do.
I do like what I do, yes.
Okay. So why?
Good question. Well, I really like words. We were in the visit to the printing plant yesterday. There was a guy we met who had come over from the editorial side to run the business side, and at the printing plant at the Lakeland Ledger, which is where we print. The business guys were suspicious of him, he said at first, because they thought he was a word monkey. And I said, that's a really good term. I like that. I want to be, that's what I am, that's what we do. We're word monkeys. We monkey around with words, and it's satisfying to that in that level. But I like storytelling and I like reading stories. It's exciting to me when something comes across my desk that makes me want to stand up from my cubicle and say, this is great. Or, people who write for me or work in the staff, I hope it's exciting when I'm sitting there chuckling and it's because of something one of them wrote. Scott is a good example. I want that experience, and I like that experience of there being something that we're creating every week that can involve someone. That whether or not it sends them off to see something new, because I guess that's another part of why I do it. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Cape Cod. I love Cape Cod, but I would never have spent my life there. I wanted to get to a city real quick, and these papers were representative of that experience, I think. They're up there, and to be in a position to sort of support the growth of an urban attitude where diversity is appreciated, where
I like that,
where,
urban attitude.
yeah, and where arts and entertainment are respected, and where the issues of people living together in a city are at the forefront. I do think it's interesting to come at the general pop culture universe now from an alternative point of view, to sort of provide a little bit of snark in your attitude toward it, because there's so much of it being thrown at us, but I don't think we can ignore that as a publication.
What
now.
does snark mean?
Snark. It's an overused term for tongue-in-cheek
Like you're snarky.
sarcasm.
Snarkasm?
Snarkasm. Oh, we've coined a word. Good.
So
Does
do you
that answer your
think,
question?
so one thing you've sort of mentioned, but you must think that creative loafing provides a contribution to
Oh,
the
yeah.
area,
I do.
that it gives us something that nothing else
I
gives
hope
us.
so. I know that when I go to a city, I look for a paper like this. I know that when I knew that Tampa Bay had a weekly planet, I thought better of Tampa Bay. I thought, oh, good. There are people with an alternative point of view. There are people who want to experience a publication and experience the city in a way that I sympathize with. I liked that it existed, meant there was a community. And I think that's that I could identify with. And that comes through actually from It has been the case in all of the papers I've worked with that from the CEO on down, the word they talk about the most is community. That they feel like that's what these papers are about. They're about embodying and enriching the lives of the community that they're in. I don't think that's different from a daily paper, but it may be that our definition of community is different than theirs. I often think about this, and I studied theater. I've been an actor and a director, and the two places that I most felt at home with the first time I ever went in them were an empty theater and this really grungy single room, unheated loft of an office that was the first place the Philadelphia City paper was. And I stepped in that and I looked around and it was dirty, but the people were interesting. They were really passionate about writing. They were funny, and it felt like home. So two homes I've shared, and that's a large part of why I like it.
So what education did you have?
I went to public high school in Cape Cod, Dennis Yarmouth Regional High School, Dolphins. Yeah, really, Dolphins. And very aggressive. And then I went to Harvard and studied English there.
As an undergraduate, you were an English major.
Yeah, I took some time off as a teacher. In elementary grades, actually, in a private school in Connecticut, and then got a job in a private school in outside the suburbs of Philly, and that's how I got down there. And left that to go to grad school at Villanova in theater. And somewhere along the way, in the last couple of years, I spent a year in Columbia as an arts journalism fellow from 2001, 2002.
So, how are your parents? What did your parents think about education?
Oh, I think probably my mother was the major mover and shaker in planting it in my head that I was going to do well in school. Both of my parents are very literate folks. I mean, my mother worked in a bank. My father
In a bank?
My father had a dry cleaning business. They split when I was very young. He went on to marry several other people. It's
an alternative.
Right. My father was living the alternative lifestyle very early. My father's 96. He's in a nursing home in Brewster, Massachusetts. I think he's dictating them, but he still writes me these long letters and emails, which are very articulate, and they might be about Red Sox, they might be about how sorry he is he got divorced from my mother, they might be any number of things, but they're great to read. My brother, I have one brother who's a kind of like a novelist, manqué, is that the right word to put it? Who I think someday wants to write a novel, but he's doing lamp parts now, so he works for a lamp maker. Actually, all the lighting fixtures in the Meridian, they come from my brother. Or at least he makes them pay the bills. I don't know exactly what he does. But it was a household where words mattered. I mean, I wouldn't call it. Neither one of my parents went. My mother went to Emerson for a while and then dropped out because of money. My father went to like a dry cleaning institute, but his parents went to Cornell and Ithaca, so there was a period, some tradition there of education, and I knew pretty early on that what I needed to do to buff up my resume to get into the schools I wanted to get into when I was like in 8th grade.
Really? The reason I ask is because this has been something with all of the guests that have been very interesting, is how important education has been to where they've gone. And that's, in terms of topics that we talk about, education seems to be the one that the audience, and as well as I, are the most passionate about. And issues about how do we make our education as good as it can be in this community, and looking at people who have become successful in some broad sense of success, what's contributed to that? And education seems to be a very important factor in that.
I think that's one of the reasons I went into teaching out of college at first, because there had been some very inspiring teachers along the way and right from the start, from in elementary grades, I remember teachers that instilled that joy in words, which is something that I really liked sharing with little kids. The Phantom Toll Booth and the last of the really great Wang Doodles, which was by Julie Andrews, which you should really find out. Yes, Julie Andrews wrote a really cool children's book. And I shared that with those kids, and I didn't much like teaching math. I was really bad at that, so that was one of the reasons I left that field. But and it was really interesting to and this was this in the 70s, but I think this is probably more true than ever, is that the kids whose parents really limited their use of electronic media, which was TV, that's all they had to use in those days, had much more interesting imaginations. They had much more original imaginations. And I think that that's a continuing challenge now, I think, for teachers. At the same time that I think something like getting kids turned on to like Harry Potter and other young adult stuff is actually nurturing imaginations.
It's Ms. Rollins' birthday today, too.
Oh, is it really?
Yes.
Wow.
The author of Harry Potter. Yes. Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. We should. Do you see anything in common between Robert and J.K. Rowling?
I'm just as rich.
Good for you.
Rich has many meetings.
Rich has many meetings. In journalism, that's so true.
So one of the things that we find in newspapers, and I guess because having personal experience, having people write about us recently, is that so the question of how much is truth and facts important as opposed to sensation to get people to read. So we find oftentimes the headlines in a paper, like I'm thinking more of a daily paper, are somewhat misleading. And so it hooks in with this thing that we know papers, and this is what I don't understand, how you can be a free paper, because regular papers, daily papers, are having a very tough financial time to stay in business. And so they have to do all types of things to get people to read the paper, both the, newspaper, paper, and online. So how do papers deal with that? Because as I started the conversation, newspapers are, as I see, the vehicle to tell me what's going on in my community, politically or to everything. And I expect that to be the truth or the facts. But oftentimes when I know a lot about what's going on and I read the newspaper, I go, really? So as editor-in-chief, that's your job to make sure that the truth be told. So can you address this, what I'm talking about?
Well, I think the headline writing is an art, and it actually is a different art online as opposed to print. And a different art form in daily papers than in weekly papers. And as it is in the difference between a daily paper and a magazine. And then what happens that sometimes the headline that makes sense in print then gets truncated and shows up in, say, a list of stories on a mobile app or in Facebook with a picture that's brought up to it, and the picture and the headline perhaps don't jibe. So there are a lot of different areas where you need to be aware of what impression you're giving. And that's a very important thing. I mean, I think that you need to look at the page after the headline's been created and say, okay, I know what I meant, but if I'm the casual observer who just happened to glance at this page, is that the message that would have gotten to them? I mean, we had an interesting situation.
Does the author of the article write the headline?
Some authors author headlines. It's usually an editor. In dailies, it's often more a copy editor. The editor-in-chief would sign off on it, I assume, in a daily. But the authors don't always see it before it goes to press.
Oh.
No, I mean, I know that I'm speaking for Peter and for Scott and for Megan, you rarely see those headlines before because they've submitted these stories to us.
Do they ever get outraged by the...
And Scott writes headlines as well, and he's on the other side of the cubicle from me, but I would write a headline more likely for your column. And if somebody were in the room and wanted to argue with me about it, I'd absolutely listen. Sometimes the final decision does get affected by how you see it on that page.
Do the headlines sell the paper?
Well, it depends. For us, the cover is very important.
The picture.
The picture and what the copy is. I mean, that's an ongoing battle, is to figure out what's going to get people to pick that up out of a box, out of a rack, you know, it's not a science for us because we're surprised constantly. Something that we thought would be a surefire pickup is not. Something that we thought wouldn't go at all does. We have found pretty much that old white men don't do sales for us. So whenever we put an old white man on the cover, he just doesn't get picked up. Despite the fact that an old white man edits it, it's not. I know that's not my audience that's picking up the paper.
Well, that's good for me.
But an interesting thing happened this week, which is kind of like a headline, but it's a similar situation. One of the visual theme that the interns, the intern issue, that the interns and the creative director Todd Bates came up with was because they were thinking about being so concerned about growing up. He, with their assent, said, okay, let's do Peter Pan as the visual theme. And they, Amy very nicely went out and found a deal on green felt hats with white feathers. And then I think she collected some basic green t-shirts from like Walmart or something. And they, each of them, did a pose besides this one that was connected to the theme of one of the stories they wrote. And Jackie Brage, who's a really talented young writer from the University of Tampa, wrote about open mic nights. And she had a really funny opening line. I should actually read it to you, because this was the opening line that didn't cause a problem, but almost did. It's, for my performance tonight, I will pantomime a porn star making a pizza delivery to someone's home. Here we go, folks. Now that's a quote from a performer at an open mic night, a performer who was going to mime a porn star making a pizza delivery. And at the end of the story, she says, these are in her support of open mic nights, that these are places for people to come out and support their peers and local performers, because let's face it, a city that doesn't take pride in its porn star pizza delivery pantomime is truly no city at all. And at some level, that's kind of true. But I thought that's such a great line, that first quote, and we didn't get a chance to use her picture anywhere else in the book of her with a microphone like singing into a mic with her Peter Pan hat and her feather, that I wanted to put it on the table of contents. Because I choose what gets featured in the table of contents, which is another kind of a headlining experience. And so I had this picture of her with her microphone. Underneath it, it said, "I will now perform a pantomime of a porn star doing a pizza home delivery." And I thought, okay, that isn't what I thought, that isn't the impression I intended to give. I didn't want people to think that Jackie was about to give a performance as a porn star making a pizza
Her
delivery.
mom probably wouldn't like it.
And her mom, I figured UT would give her a hard time, and so I used another line from the story, which was just that she said about open mic nights, that things are inclined to get slightly weird, which summed it up better and didn't get her in a potential trouble.
So that's
and
a good
that was only
example about
because
what you do.
I looked at the page after it came through to me and I said, no, that won't work. And I don't always catch those things, and that's when trouble happens. But I told her about this whole story and she wished I'd kept it because she thought it was hilarious. But
So how do you manage to have your paper free?
Intrepid ad salespeople.
So why don't dailies do that? I mean, all these daily papers are having a hard time. Why can't they do the same thing?
Well, TBT sort of does.
But what about
It's free.
the Chicago paper or
All of-
Philadelphia?
All of the alt weeklies, almost all of them are free.
No, I mean the daily
dailies.
paper. Like they've been firing people like crazy.
I know. Well, we had our period of that as well.
Star Ledger in Jersey.
It's a different economic model. It's just a different model.
But they don't have the same ads that you have. You have a
There's-
lot of ads.
There are some overlaps. There's, I think our ads really look good, and that's, no, actually I do. I think that's an important part of what a publication like ours is about. You want there are publishers who make the argument that the ads are as much content as the edit, and and I suppose there's an argument for that because it is something sometimes people open the paper to see. They read News of the Weird and they go to the music ads. I have to accept that there are people who read the paper like that. But the same rules obviously don't apply. The content that we control as edit is very different from the content that the ads represent.
So given that you do this whole paper, which is about the Tampa Bay area, what insights do you have about where we live? For example, what is the similarity between St. Petersburg and Tampa? How are they alike? Everyone
How are
talks
they
about how they're
alike,
different,
huh?
but how are they alike?
I think they're growing more alike. They couldn't have been more different, I don't think, at least when I got here 10 years ago. There was no downtown culture to speak of in the heart of downtown Tampa. I mean, it was in the outskirts. It was Seminole Heights, Viva La Frida. It was the interesting things were happening in the outskirts of downtown Tampa, or at USF or at UT. I mean, it was and that gradual sort of like focus on what could happen if you actually treated your downtown like a livable city, as opposed to like a place where you go to work and then go to South Tampa afterwards. That's changed, and I think it's changed because of Bay envy to some degree. I mean,
St. Pete
St.
envy.
Pete has gotten a lot more play lately, and deservedly so. And but it's really interesting. We had our 25th anniversary a couple of years ago because Creative Loafing Weekly Planet, Creative Loafing has been here 25 plus years now. And I went back and looked at the very first story in the very first issue of Creative Loafing in 1988? I don't remember the exact year. It was one of the 87 or 88. And the title was Bridging the Bay, How can we bring Tampa and St. Petersburg closer together? Will there ever be a stadium in Tampa? It was like the same issues 25 years ago were still in our first issue. And that bridge, that's mystifying to a lot of people from out of town like
Yes, it
me.
is.
That it's such a barrier for people. And that, and I maybe it's something that those of us who didn't grow up here should learn to understand better, which I'm just beginning to understand, that however much we want to think of this, the regionalism idea is that there are some very entrenched local cultures in both Tampa and St. Pete whose twain ain't meeting real soon. So to bring, and I think the arts and is helping with that. I mean, I think that what happened with the Tampa Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts in bridging the Bay, literally in the Chinese exhibit, and people going to see both halves of that show, which was a magnificent show, that was a real promising sign. And I want to see more collaborations like that. We've tried to foster that with events like GASP, which was an interdisciplinary arts event we did at the Tampa Museum of Art. We're doing our Best of the Bay this year for the first time in St. Petersburg at the Coliseum, September 18th. Mark your calendars. So, I mean, I think we can play a role in getting those things, but I think it's beginning to happen. I mean, people are beginning to cross that bridge for reasons other than work. But the roots of the two places were so distinct that there's a lot of hurdles to get over. I mean, manufacturing, business, banking, tourism. That's what the two halves are, and that's changing.
I mean, do you think it's a good idea that the two main cities merge, or do you think it's good that they keep their identities?
Oh, they have to keep their identity. I think the thing about Tampa is it's just sort of creating an identity. I don't think, I mean, you could, and we have the same problem in St. Pete. I mean, the number of times the national events like the convention and the World Series say that, you know, they're in Tampa when they're actually at the Trop or at their, and going to an event in St. Petersburg, that bugs everybody here, I'm sure. And so that's something we still have to get over, and we still have that image of being St. Petersburg, the way people used to think of it. But it's St. Petersburg that's showing up in those lists now. It's St. Petersburg that's getting the buzz. And Tampa, you don't think Bob Buckhorn's jealous of that. He certainly is. And
we have a city council member here.
No, we do.
Steve Cornell's here.
Yes.
Yes, so his ears are burning.
Berg envy.
Berg envy.
Berg envy, that's even better. I mean, I think the similarities are also embodied in the paper, too. I mean, I think that there are readers of a paper like Creative Loafing that live in Seminole Heights, that live in South Tampa, that live in downtown Tampa, that also live in neighborhoods in Pinellas, and they're seeking out diversity, they're seeking out arts, they're seeking out a different view about politics, they want to dive deeper into a subject, and it's the fact that M&F is here. That's another. And the USF is so successful. I mean, the fact that those exist, that speaks well to somebody who comes from another place here. Because it's so many, as I said earlier, there's so many misconceptions, preconceptions about Florida that get, unfortunately, reinforced by some of our government figures on the state level. And in other counties, but it's our job to sort of like let the world know that we're not all Rick Scotts, we're not all Rhonda Stormses, and that change that's been happening in Hillsborough, for instance, which is reflecting a change across the country, but the fact that they're repealing the ban against gay pride, that they're supporting domestic partnerships, that these things are beginning to happen over there. They're learning from St. Pete.
It's pretty remarkable how Hillsboro's changing.
Yeah.
Now, why is it that St. Pete has been so much more progressive than Hillsboro?
I don't know. I mean, I don't, you may have people who've lived here longer than I have might have a better answer for that. Maybe it's in the water. But, oh, yeah. I wonder if perhaps the existence of the St. Petersburg Times has something to do with that. I mean, I mean, for all our talk about the difference between the papers,
Right.
that's a really good paper.
Very good.
And
We have Sandra Gatson here, who used to be well-known with the
and it's a paper that that is worthy of respect across the country. And I think that the kind of thoughtfulness that goes into that paper either reflects well on the populace, or maybe it affected the populace. It's hard to know chicken and egg there, but
Well, that's very interesting because, of course, it used to be the St. Pete Times, and its focus was our town. And now that it's changed, I have to say that, now they're doing who to pick for school board and who to pick for judges in Hillsboro. And I read that on the editorial page, and I go, what are they talking about Hillsboro for? This is our paper. And there's a sense in which there had been, and I've lived here, 12 years or something, this sense of ownership, that there was a place where it would really talk about us. And I know that in a year or a few years that it won't strike me as odd.
I know what you mean, though, and not having been here to have that much sort of sense of ownership about it, but really it bugged me when that change happened, because for this very reason, it gave St. Petersburg something to brag about.
Yeah.
This Pulitzer Prize-winning paper is in St. Petersburg. It's not Tampa.
And it focused on us.
And I have heard that from people who feel like it's not as giving as much attention to St. Pete as it used to. I don't necessarily see that, but I don't see that the St. Petersburg Tribune has made many inroads either on this side of the bay, and because...
Are there any people in here who live in Tampa? No, well, yeah, a few people. Do you read the Trib?
I read it online, but long ago I let my...
Megan, do you read the Trib?
No, I don't.
And how many people in St. Petersburg read the Tampa Bay Times? A lot.
Are we going to do the embarrassing thing and ask them how many of them read Creative Loafing? Oh, good. You're very nice.
Everybody.
Thank you.
We didn't even have to ask that question. That's a
There were a few
given.
hands that weren't raised. We need to get some papers in those people's hands.
So, I mean, these are interesting questions. And what you said earlier about your paper is when I read your paper, the St. Pete, Tampa, Clearwater, I take for granted that I'm going to see the whole gamut, and that I actually go to your paper to find out where to go in Tampa. Because I have a sense of where to go here, but I don't know that. But
that's
I look
interesting.
at your paper to help me find where to go. Especially like restaurants, and the best of the Bay really helps me do that.
Well, it's been a project we've done recently, which has been really educational for us, and I think has been useful to readers as this neighborhood issues that we've been doing. We've been alternating for different parts of the Bay, but sort of like deep immersion in one neighborhood for one entire issue. Next week, actually, is our Gulfport issue. And, oh, good. Are there some Gulfporters here? And it's been... We've hung out there, we've eaten there, we've stayed there, we've interviewed people for about a month. And it's, as we've done it with Ybor City, we did it with Dunedin, we did it with Seminole Heights. And it's a way of us facing that challenge, which is we are a small staff trying to encompass this huge geographic area with all these different places. But if we can identify those places that we think are most interesting to the readers and have a concentration of of businesses and political developments and interesting artists and restaurants, and can tell the story of that, that gets us, that enlightens us as well as the readers. So that's an ongoing challenge, though. I mean, it's a question sometimes too. It's always a question in terms of listings. How comprehensive do you need or want to be? These papers, when they were bigger, because page counts definitely have gone down in the past years for all print publications. Everything that came in as a listing was in there, and they went out for pages. They also had pages and pages of classified ads,
Right.
which we don't have, and as many anymore. So there's a question as to whether to try to be comprehensive at all, to be very specific, saying these are the things we picked and that's it. You can find the rest of it online on our comprehensive online listings, which is another way to go, and everything can be more comprehensive online. But it's good to hear that you look for that, because that's what it's trying to do, and usually successful.
Do you think that we will get rid of this and just be online?
That's the standard question these days, and the problem is, and I think all 5 of those people in that picture are speak to this issue, is that they don't read print. College.
They don't read.
They read
print online.
I'm sure they read this issue very thoroughly, but
They don't have an object in there.
not as much as we did.
Wow.
So that's something that has to be dealt with. That
So they read all their news online.
I would think that that's the case. But
Wow.
on the other hand, there are people in that group who are editors in their own college publications.
How many people in here read all their, don't read a physical newspaper, do all online? That doesn't surprise me.
The youngest person in the room.
Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh. How many people read a physical paper?
Wow.
I know that. How many people read both physical paper and online? Huh. Interesting. How many prefer the physical paper? How many people under 40 prefer the physical paper?
One.
How many people under 40 prefer the online paper? Is there anyone under 40 in here?
There were a few.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Harris.
It's the lighting. We can't see them all.
Yeah, that's interesting. I am so addicted to this.
Well,
this-
I
I'm
would like to encourage your addiction.
Yeah, well, don't
Do
worry.
whatever I can do to enable you will be.
Newspaper Anonymous.
Yes, right. But, it's hard to predict.
Yeah, huh. Okay, so who has a question for David Warner? Yes, can you stand up and say your name? Wait, we're going to get you a mic. So everyone, but say your name first.
Where do I find this paper?
Okay, say your name first.
My name is Zina Cherkis, and I'm from Gulfport.
Yeah.
And where do I find this paper?
Well, we are distributed all over Tampa Bay in boxes, usually red boxes, unless they're covered with artistic graffiti, and in racks in various places. I know there's a rack outside Stella's.
Stella's.
And I saw them drop some at the Neptune Grill the other day. So they are there. We actually, in doing the issue on Gulfport, are realizing we don't have enough distribution points.
But you
there.
live in Town Shores, don't you? How about, is there one in Town Shores? That's a big
I
population.
don't know that there is a Town Shores. We were just there, and I didn't see a box. Yeah.
So that might be,
Mm-hmm.
there's a big readership there. Who else has a question? Who's shouting? Okay, could you get a mic and say your name and ask?
Yeah, I'm Frank Chapman from St. Petersburg. And I wanted to ask you, like, being somebody who grew up on the Village Voice and then Campus Briefs and all these different alternatives, and I think I've read so many of them. But as more and more people start living in the alternative world, where do you see the future of where is the alternative anymore?
Oh, that's a good.
That's a great
that's an
question.
excellent question.
Yeah.
I mean, that has been at the heart of the business for the last several years. I mean, you look at. I mean, I think, for instance, and I'm speaking maybe from my own perspective. For instance, alternative papers were often in the vanguard in writing about LGBT issues, inequality, and the dailies perhaps were a little bit behind that, but that's really changed. I mean, it's changed with the culture. So that's the question of whether LGBT is alternate at all really has less to do with sexuality than it does with that particular LGBT person, how he or she lives his life. That's an area in which it's blurred. I think there's always going to be a reason for alternative papers to be looking askance at the larger culture, whether it's the way they review a movie or a visual art exhibit, or it's in the way that they delve into a political issue. There's also a long-standing alternative tradition of looking askance at what the daily papers are doing, and to call that into question. I don't think we, Creative Loafing, do that enough. I do think we pay attention closely and write about what's going on in the dailies. So it's at least it adds a voice to the conversation. And in this area, it's interesting. An earlier theme that the previous owners had for Creative Loafing was shelter, that this would provide, Creative Loafing, Weekly Planet would provide shelter, which I sort of hated.
What's that mean?
I'll explain it. That's how I understood it. They used like a nuclear, you know, the symbol that used to be in a nuclear fallout shelter as our symbol. You might remember that. It was on the old papers. And my initial reaction was, wow, what a great idea. We're going to encourage people to huddle inside shelters and not go out. That's what Creative Loafing is about.
In New York City, I understand that.
Right.
That, you know, when I came down here and I'd read the papers and everything, I would say, oh, gee, these people down. I mean, this was 30 years ago. So I'd go to the Creative, well, it was the Planet then.
Yeah.
So I'd go to the Planet to find out what was going on and to find people who were similar to where I grew up.
That's what shelter meant. That's what they were. That's what they were trying to get at. And however inopportune a word that was, it still, I think, reflects a mission of these papers. And I think that mission still holds. I do think that does. I think that you can go to a paper like this in any city, if you're going to Kansas City or something, if you're going to Cincinnati, where maybe don't have traditionally, they're not going to have the people you want to meet. That you're going to have to seek them out, and a place to seek them out, to seek out those voices and those thinkers and those events is in a paper like this. So I think, and that's, although we're a lot more open-minded in St. Pete and Tampa than St. Pete and Tampa used to be, from my understanding, I still think it serves that role. I think it still has that shelter mission.
Well, you know, what's interesting about this discussion that you're having now is that it just struck me that these alternative papers tend to be, as we would say, liberal. and that we could have alternative papers, alternative to the mainstream dailies, that weren't liberal, that were alternative in a conservative way. But we really don't have them, or do we?
We
I mean,
have
in
Fox
Philadelphia-
News.
Right, but I mean a weekly, like the Pitch in Kansas City.
No, it's
They're
an
all
interesting
the
question. I mean,
liberal-
I would not totally generalize that all alt weeklies are liberal. I think there's more of a move toward libertarianism in some of these papers. The New Times chain, which is Miami New Times and Westward, and I think they own the Village Voice now, if I'm not wrong. There's a different strain in those owners. But that's not out of sync with what a alternative paper's mission is. I think we gave more coverage to the libertarian candidate in the recent race between Jolly and Alex Sink than anybody did, and now Adrian Wiley is maybe going to be a spoiler in the race for governor, who's the libertarian candidate, and I think that's a real important role that a paper like ours can do, can looking at that.
Knowing a lot of conservative people, they actually do read a lot of the libertarian articles that are further than that. What you're just saying. You know, a lot of people do lean more towards libertarian ideas. So, yeah, I think you do kind of cover it.
Well, I think that also is reflected in some of our younger population of readers. There's a libertarian streak now that, I mean, the cliche is socially liberal and fiscally conservative, but that does kind of reflect it. I mean, the fact that somebody like David Jolly could use a conservative argument for gay marriage, which is great. He's a little late. I mean, Andrew Sullivan was making it like 10 years ago, but still, great that he's joined the party. I think that is a very savvy move on his part, because there's a lot of younger Republican voters who don't see what the big deal is about gay marriage, for instance. And that is, to some degree, a libertarian point of view.
So who else has a question? Yes, we used to, is it Denny?
Yes.
Oh, hi, Denny. Here, wait, get the, and could you say your name, Denny?
Oh, sure.
And who you are, what, and
Denny Elliott. I live in St. Petersburg.
you're also teaching the journalism.
I do.
Yeah.
I teach in the journalism. No,
Teaching the journalism.
I'm Department Chair of Journalism and Media Studies here at USF St. Pete. Thank you for employing so many of our graduates.
You have sent us some excellent
Yes,
students.
yes. You've gotten the best. I have a history as a subversive ethics coach, which is kind of my point. In fact, I many years ago worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and over the years I've counseled many daily newspaper reporters when they have a really good story that they can't get their paper to publish to go to the nearest weekly alternative. And I'd like to hear you address the important voice that you and other alternative weeklies have in this country in terms of telling the untold stories that can't be told for any number of reasons in the dailies.
First, did you send any stories to the city paper or the weekly when you were at the Inquirer?
No comment.
Because right now, I can't even imagine that happening. I don't feel like a Trib or a Times reporter would feel comfortable with the future of his or her job to be doing that.
Oh, anonymously, of course.
Okay, then we wouldn't be able to print it. Then, to have us do the story that they couldn't get done.
You're right.
I see. Yeah. I mean, there's so many stories that need to be told and then that's the other part of this, is that I think that the more voices, the better. The daily papers are saying no all the time to great stories, and we all are because of space and budget limitations. My concern is that I love the idea of having a writer be able to stay with a story for a long time, and that's what you sometimes have to do with stories like you're discussing. You have to be able to spend the time with court records. You have to be able to spend the time with interviews, with field work. And if that person is also, editing a section of a paper and writing a daily column and writing blog posts all day, the idea of being able to do all of those things is pretty daunting, if not impossible. I'm trying to make room for my writers to be able to do that, but that's one of the logistical issues. It's always there. I mean, somebody called me the other day about the story that took place in Seminole Heights recently, where the police seemed to use excessive force for a pot dealer who was very minor, and excessive force to the extent of killing the guy. And the story did eventually get some coverage in the dailies. I had gotten it and had spread it and given it to two of my reporters, one a freelancer, one a regular, and they just didn't have room in their bandwidth to take care of it. And the question is then for me, is how do you make that happen when I also have all this other stuff on my plate to get these other issues through, and where you prioritize, and that's a constant battle. But persistence on the part of anybody who needs to get a story out is the most important thing. I mean, persistence is the most important thing for a reporter too, in not taking the first slammed phone receiver as an answer, but keeping on making the calls. I would hope, and I don't know that this is true, but I would hope that for the dailies and for the weeklies and in Tampa Bay, that we have give a sense of an open enough door that somebody can say, okay, I understand. He couldn't talk to me now. I'll call him next week. I'll call him again. I'll call him again. And that's what I would recommend. If anybody in this room has a story they feel like needs to be told, I reserve the right to finally say it's not a story, but I also may not have heard it right the first time. And that's the other part of it.
Well, I have time for one last question. Who has a question? Yeah, okay. We need a mic, and you stand up and say your name, please.
Thank you. Hi, Ann Drake McMullen. David, you and I went to the same high school.
You're kidding.
Dennis Yarmouth Regional High School.
You're kidding. When did you graduate? Oh, sorry. I'll tell you if you tell me.
So you're a dolphin?
We'll talk later.
You're a dolphin?
I'm a dolphin.
You're a dolphin.
A DY dolphin.
We'll go sing the team song later.
Okay, later. My final question is, I know that's weird. There's several of us here, actually. We'll talk. Alex Glenn's wife is a graduate.
Who?
Alex Glenn, the CEO of Duke Energy.
Oh, him. The one who keeps raising my bills higher and higher and higher. Him.
Anyway.
His wife is a dolphin, too?
Can't you do something about that?
Bill Horton from All Children's Hospital.
Really?
We'll talk.
Bill Horton?
Bill Horton.
Oh my God, I think I know him. Oh well.
You probably do.
Go on later.
Okay, quick question before she throws me out. So as she's talking about the demise of newspapers on some level, long term, 25 years, I hear journalism teachers, professors talk about all kids want to do is Twitter. They can't read, they can't write. They're texting and they're Twittering, and there is no journalism. What's the future of journalism? What's the future of our youth? So our 20-year-olds today who don't read any newspapers, what are they going to do 25 years from now? And what are we going to be writing? Are we going to be blogging in unverified blogs that the amount of truth is negligible in them? So what's the reality of journalism 25 years from now?
Well, I think the good news in all that, which is new, really, is how much writing's being done. I mean, there's a lot of people out there writing stuff, and it's not, most of it, terribly good, but there's the impulse is there. So the impulse to communicate is perhaps even stronger nowadays than ever, because it's so instantaneous, because you can reach out to people and you can see the effect you have on people. So does that naturally become a leap toward feeling invested in communications that's really solid, that's exploring something new, is unveiling something new, in depth?
Depth is the issue.
Depth is the problem, yeah. And I mean, this is again perhaps coming from a warped perspective, but one of my best young reporters, somebody who came from the Poynter Institute Young Reporters Workshop, and went on to, was a staff writer for me. He edited the Sarasota paper. We had that for now. Now what he does is he has something called longform.com, which is about supporting and sharing long, in-depth stories online, which people used to say no one had the time for, that no one really wanted to do. They just wanted to read tweets. But he is not alone. There are other venues like that, that if the numbers aren't as big as they used to be, there are people still who are hungry for it. And I have to hope that in university level, students of journalism are going to keep that going, because there's no shortage of them, I don't think. I think communications majors, maybe because they're the fallback major for people who don't know what else to do, but they're still working on communications in many cases and have to be exposed to more sophisticated writing. I have to say I was very encouraged by the people I worked with this year.
The interns.
Yeah, the willingness to work hard, even outside their comfort zone. The couple of the kids were mostly wanted to be music journalists, but that's not all they wrote about. I mean, I think that, and there's an ego boost in getting your name out there, which is what Twitter is all about, is what Facebook is all about. And if you can sort of convince young students that you can get that same ego boost and an actual job in journalism, then we should promote that. So.
Yay. So thank you all for coming, and thank David Warner, the editor-in-chief.
Thank you.
So in August, our town's taking a vacation, so we won't be here in August, but we'll start up again in September, and my guest is going to be Sophia Wyszewska, the Chancellor of USSP.
Cool.
And then in October, it's Kanika Tomlinson, who's our deputy mayor. So two really fantastic women, and I hope you will all come. And thank you for coming and making our town such a great place to live. Thank you.